January 1945. Somewhere in France. It is a dawn filtered through a scrim of frost and the exhaust fumes of 1,000 waiting vehicles. The road outside the wrought iron gates is a river of grey-green misery flowing west, a staggering, endless column of German prisoners, mostly men, their faces hollowed by defeat, by the crushing failure of the Ardennes offensive, by the relentless, mechanized advance of an enemy whose depth seemed bottomless. They shuffle past a chateau, its elegant lines now stark under the winter sky, its gates crowned not with a family crest, but with the stark, pragmatic white star of the United States Army. The air smells of damp earth, diesel, and the faint, metallic scent of fear. A deuce-and-a-half truck, its engine grumbling like a weary beast, halts on the cobblestones. From its canvas-covered back, a dozen women disembark, movements stiff, eyes fixed on the ground or scanning the windows of the chateau with a practiced, wary discretion. They are members of the Wehrmachthelferinnen, the armed forces' female auxiliaries, and others from the signals and administrative units attached to the retreating German forces. Their uniforms, once impeccably pressed, symbols of their privileged role in the regime's machinery, are now travel-stained and creased, but one detail on each of them catches the frail winter sun. A last defiant gleam of normalcy, their hair. Each woman wears it long, meticulously cared for, braided and coiled in the severe, traditional manner prescribed not just by military regulation, but by a deeper, more insidious state ideology. It is a last bastion of the familiar, a personal flag still flying amidst the collapse of their world. They expect stern interrogation, confusing paperwork, the cold, professional disdain of the victor. They do not expect the two American Army nurses waiting beside a makeshift table, their expressions unreadable, their hands resting near a mundane, devastating array of tools, several pairs of sturdy silver scissors, ordinary combs, and a large, galvanized steel tub. To understand the profound, personal shock resonating in that frozen courtyard, one must first understand the precise nature of these women's service and the totalitarian world that sculpted them. They were not frontline combatants in the legal sense, but in the total war cosmology of the Third Reich, there were no true bystanders, no apolitical spaces. The Wehrmachthelferinnen and their more ideologically committed SS counterparts, the SS Helferinnen, were a carefully engineered component of the war effort, recruited from the most fervent ranks of the Bund Deutscher Mägdel, the female Hitler Youth. They were selected for proven political reliability, racial purity verified by meticulous Onenpass, ancestry passes, and a fanatical loyalty to the Nazi cause. They were, as one SS recruitment pamphlet declared, soldiers without weapons, but standard-bearers of the National Socialist worldview. At the very heart of the military apparatus, they operated the switchboards that connected army groups, typed the confidential orders for operations that decimated cities, tracked Luftwaffe raids on translucent maps, and processed the cold, bureaucratic paperwork of occupation and, indirectly, the Holocaust. Their war was one of files, frequencies, and encrypted messages, but it was war nonetheless. Their meticulously groomed appearance was a mandated part of the performance. It spoke of wholesome, Aryan womanhood, of natural vigor and disciplined beauty, of visual propaganda piece in a state where every personal detail, from the cut of your clothes to the books on your shelf, was a political statement. Their capture, therefore, was more than a military event. It was the violent, sudden collapse of the entire ideological and social universe that had given their lives meaning, structure, and a perverse sense of glory. They were the human periphery of the crumbling Reich, and now they were being gathered in. These women, schooled for years in the potent mythology of the Endsieg, the final victory or a heroic, Wagnerian Götterdämmerung, had mentally prepared for a captor's cruelty born of battlefield hatred and revenge. Propaganda had painted the Americans as gangsters, as a mongrel race devoid of culture, capable of any atrocity. They steeled themselves for violence, for violation, perhaps even for the martyrdom they had been told awaited them at the hands of the barbaric Ames. They braced for a foe who would mirror the brutal image their own regime had projected onto the world. Instead, they encountered the impersonal, overwhelming, and baffling machinery of the United States at war. Their humiliation was not one of passionate bloodshed, but of calm, disinterested procedure. It was administered not by enraged, battle-grimy infantrymen, but by efficient, unsmiling female nurses following a sanitary protocol outlined in a manual thousands of miles away. The psychological disorientation this caused was total, a cognitive rupture more damaging in some ways than fear. The enemy they faced did not match the cartoonish monster of Goebbels' walk-in show newsreels. He was bafflingly well-fed, equipped with a bewildering abundance of everything from vehicles to chewing gum, and he operated by a vast, incomprehensible rule-book that somehow allowed for both overwhelming force and a rigid adherence. To process, the deepest violation, then, came not from a fist or a rifle butt, but from the sterile snip-snip-snip of the shears. It was a systematic dismantling of personal and ideological identity performed under the bland, irrefutable banner of public health. They had expected to be conquered. Instead, they were being processed. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force SHAF policy, derived from hard-won experience in the Mediterranean and earlier campaigns, mandated the delousing of all prisoners of war as a non-negotiable first step in processing. Typhus, carried by body lice, had ravaged armies and civilian populations for centuries. It was a silent, democratic killer that respected no rank or ideology. Hair, a known harbor for lice and their nits, had to go. The procedure was universal. For the millions of male prisoners, a shorn head was a minor indignity, almost a soldier's rite of passage into captivity. For these women, it was a visceral, culturally specific trauma. As one Helferin, recorded in post-war interviews as Annelies Weber, later recounted, they stood us in a line in the courtyard. No one shouted. She just pointed to my hair, then to the chair, and made a cutting motion with her fingers. I tried to explain, to say it was clean, but she didn't understand or didn't care to. I began to cry silently, not from pain, but from a kind of emptying out. It was that moment, with the cold air on my neck, that I truly understood. We were not just prisoners of war. Every snip, every lock that fell onto the ground, felt like she was cutting away the last piece of the Germany I knew. Official U.S. Army records from the Provost Marshal's office in the European theater are dry and laconic. They note the processing of approximately 4,500 female auxiliary personnel in the winter and spring of 1945, with standard sanitation and delousing measures applied uniformly per Army Regulation 600 to 900. A medical officer's field report from a similar camp in March 1945 states, matter-of-factly, female POWs present unique disciplinary and sanitary challenges. Long hair necessitates rigorous delousing procedure. The stark, bureaucratic language of the victor's archive holds no space for the panic, the shame, the silent weeping of a young woman watching a part of her identity fall into the mud of a French courtyard. The data points 4,500 or 600 to 900 tell a story of scale and regulation, but they mute the human echo of the shears. The shearing was a catalytic moment, a brutal and intimate point of no return. As the hair, that carefully cultivated symbol of their place in the Nazi racial and gender hierarchy, collected at their feet like so much discarded thread, so did the illusion of their ideological sanctity. They had believed in a cause that styled itself as epic, poetic, and historically inevitable 1,000-year Reich. Their capture revealed it as a catastrophic, mundane failure. The efficient medical checks, the orderly issue of POW rations that were, to their astonishment, ample and varied, the lack of the anticipated sexual violence or random brutalities, all of it corroded the Goebbelsian myth of the barbaric enemy. They became spectators to their own mythology's collapse, and the show was one of disconcerting normalcy. The American abundance they witnessed was a constant, low-grade shock, the endless, effortless streams of jeeps and trucks, the mountains of crated supplies, the warm, water-resistant jackets of the guards, the casual consumption of chocolate and coffee. This material reality silently, powerfully argued against the core Nazi doctrine of Lebensraum, the idea that Germany needed conquest to thrive in a world of harsh scarcity. The philosophy of the master race crumbled before the reality of the master logisticians. But for many, in the long, reflective silence of the internment camps that followed, it morphed into a brutal, personal metaphor for the defeat of the entire regime. The woman staring back from a polished mess tin the next morning, her head strangely light and cold, her features exposed and vulnerable without its frame, could no longer see a proud standard-bearer. She saw a dupe. She saw someone who had dedicated her youth to a lie whose grand architecture now amounted to this: a cold neck, a pair of silver scissors, and a ticket to a camp where the enemy fed you better than your own side had in its final, desperate months. And amidst this landscape of loss and ideological ruin, a single, humble object came to represent the baffling, overwhelming, and undeniable reality of the victor: the sea ration tin. To the German prisoners, accustomed to the dwindling, Ersatz-laden Kriegsbrot bread, acorn coffee and thin, bitter stews, the American individual ration was an object of profound, almost mythical abundance. It was a small, olive-drab cylinder, seemingly mass-produced by the millions. Yet within it lay a self-contained universe of plenty. A main unit, ham and eggs, beef stew, or chicken and vegetables. A tiny, precious envelope of soluble coffee that actually smelled of coffee. Here, in one's hands, was the industrial might and agricultural plenty of a nation an ocean away, delivered without fanfare to a muddy field in Europe. For the shorn female POWs, eating from that tin became a daily, quiet and deeply subversive lesson. The democracy that produced it, a system their ideology had derided as weak, decadent, and chaotic, could afford such staggering largesse even for its enemies. The system that had demanded their total sacrifice, that had preached the virtue of Spartan struggle, had left them and their nation starving, both materially and spiritually. The sea ration was not charity. It was a blunt, factual statement of capacity. Its very existence, its mundane reliability, its consistent presence at meal times, was a more powerful argument for a socio-economic system than any radio speech by Hitler or philosophical rant by Rosenberg had ever been against it. The click hiss of the P38 can opener, the clever little piece of stamped metal issued to every G, became the signature sound of a new world order, one built not on mythic struggle and racial destiny, but on shocking, undeniable surplus and a pragmatic, almost boring, commitment to standardization and supply. The tin was empty after the meal, but the idea it contained was not. It was perhaps the most mundane and profound truth of the aftermath, a slow, biological rebuttal to the trauma of that January day. In the long years of rubble and reconstruction, those former Helferinnen, now simply women navigating the Trümmerfrauen rubble women era, watched as their hair slowly returned, no longer shaped by state decree or military manual, but by personal choice, by available barbers, by the faint whispers of new fashions from across the Atlantic: a bob, a perm, or perhaps worn stubbornly short in a silent, complicated memory of the courtyard. This regrowth mirrored the slow, painful, and often silent regeneration of a nation itself. The scissors that had humiliated them by reducing them to a sanitary problem had also, in a cruel, unintended way, sheared away the last physical vestiges of a poisonous fantasy. The experience in that frozen courtyard was a microcosm of the war's end, not merely the triumph of one army over another, but the deafening collision of two fundamentally different realities. One was a paranoid theology of scarcity and purity, demanding endless sacrifice, its symbols rigid, theatrical, and ultimately brittle. The other, for all its impersonal, sometimes crushing power, carried within its endless supply lines, its medical manuals, and even its indifference. A different, potent principle that even the defeated enemy had a basic, procedural claim to sustenance, to order, to a life defined by something other than ideology. The falling hair was a small, personal surrender in a vast, global conflict, but in its descent, it traced the silent, undeniable arithmetic of a changing world. That freedom could wear the face of an unsmiling nurse. With scissors, that abundance could arrive in an olive-drab tin, and that the path from fanaticism back to humanity was often paved with quiet, bewildering shocks of mundane mercy. It was a journey that began with the exposure of a vulnerable neck to a cold wind and ended, years later, with a woman looking in a mirror, her hair finally her own, in a world she never dreamed she would have to build, but now, quietly, could.